Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everybody. Welcome to DC News, to my talk show Outlook, today on a beautiful Monday at lunchtime, Romanian time. I'm very pleased to host today Mr. Dave Steward from Cape Town. Dave, welcome to DC News. It's such a joy to host you again in another talk show. And thanks a lot for joining us today from Greece. You actually sacrificed a part of your holiday for this interview here on DC News. Hello.
Hello, Radu, and it's a pleasure to speak with you again and to exchange ideas at a very critical time in world history.
Well, I think we can compete with this critical time, since our ideas are even more critical than the time we're experiencing at present.
Well, the world is changing very rapidly, and there are threats from all quarters. So it is a good time to discuss the environment in which we're going to be living for the next 3 or 4 years.
That's true. Please introduce you to the Romanian and European audience, the South African audience. In case they are following our debate, they are familiar to Dave Steward. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dave Steward, a former South African diplomat to the United Nations, and you also served as the Chief of Cabinet under former State President, Mr. FW de Klerk. And then later on, you also became the Chief Executive Officer, if I'm right, of the de Klerk Foundation. And you play a key role in South Africa still nowadays in terms of preserving the constitution, actually the heritage of Mr. de Klerk in the peacemaking process. Another reason why I really wanted to have this discussion with you is, besides the fact that I enjoyed very much our first conversation last year, is your vast experience in the area of transition. You've experienced during the change of apartheid and the change to democracy, also a similar background of tensions. The way, and you experience the way how a country should deal with tensions is very important. So I think your experience is unique actually in the world, and we could learn a lot in Europe from the South African experience. That's my personal belief. I mean, I don't know how you've seen now Europe after a long break because of COVID. I understand you could not travel easily to Europe during the pandemic. What do you think about the possible social tensions and social unrest in Europe?
Everything now, I think, devolves around the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has created a completely new international situation. It signals the end of a rules-based international order. It has galvanized countries in Central and Western Europe into a new realization that the world isn't nearly such a nice place as they thought it was, that it is still a world in which countries can be threatened by conventional and even nuclear forces. So that, I think, is the first point. We're living in a new international dispensation. The second point, and I think this flows from the first point, is the tremendous economic and social disruption that have been caused by COVID and now more recently by the Ukraine war as well. The prospect for winter doesn't look good in Europe. Cold winter is coming. There was too much dependence on Russian oil, on Russian gas. And now these realities are also coming back to confront Europeans. The idea that one was going to be able to move away immediately or short term from fossil fuels is, I think, also now open for debate again, even among green parties. So we have a new situation geopolitically, we have a new situation economically. In the wake of COVID, central banks throughout the world, Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States in particular, thought that they could spend as much money as they liked. They thought that they could open the taps of reserve banks, pour trillions and trillions of dollars and euros into the system without there being any implications and consequences. And now we see the inevitable increase in inflation. So we are in, I think, in Europe and throughout the world, in a new, dangerous and volatile situation, geostrategically and also economically.
But it seems somehow strange. Europe has made a very bad experience with the dependency on fossil fuel, with dependency on oil, particularly in the 70s, because the political emancipation of the oil-producing countries in the 70s had shown Europe that they can affect the prosperity and the standard of living in Europe, throughout Europe, with high oil prices. So apparently, the European governments hasn't learned anything at all, since they have, in the 90s then, actually 20 years later, started with the concept of a new dependency, then with the dependency on Russian gas. How is it possible that governments they don't show any prudence at all in terms of making the proper choice for a serious partner you want to enter a dependency with? I mean, you cannot be such vulnerable, your industry, your households, your inflation, your whole economy, to depend actually on one or two suppliers, which are not necessarily the most serious and reliable ones in the world.
All I can do is refer you to Talleyrand's comments on the Bourbon, when he said that the Bourbon had forgotten nothing and learned nothing. And I think this is very much the way many, many governments go to work. They don't seem to learn from history. They don't seem to, they seem to think that human nature changes, that world realpolitik changes. It doesn't. We're back into a reality where people who wield power now believe that they can use it to achieve their national objectives in a way that was not acceptable during the last 50 years.
I mean, you are also experiencing the risk of social tensions and unrest in South Africa. There was some unrest last year in July, and there are critical voices who say that similar tensions might rise in future. Again, one of them is the former state president, Thabo Mbeki, who's actually blaming the government for having done much like nothing in order to prevent the resurrections of such tensions. And then we have on the very far left and rather radical political spectrum, we have Julius Malema. For those not familiar with Mr. Malema, ladies and gentlemen, Malema is a master of the so-called political theater. He broke away from the ruling African National Congress about 9 or 10 years ago. And he said something extremely aggressive this year. He said that when the unlit revolution comes, the first target is going to be white people. And that's what Mr. Malema told in the BBC's Hard Talk program, adding that the uprising would also target black elites. Now, I don't want to talk about Malema, but we have, for instance, in Romania, also radical politicians who, for instance, try to blame, in these days, America for the war in the Ukraine. I mean, a country like Romania, who is basically at the beginning of the 90s, begging America to accept them in the NATO, now is blaming America for the war in Ukraine. And I was last days shocked to read that a very famous political analyst who has also served the Romanian government has publicly declared that America never accepted true sovereign European countries and that they always will do something against European unity. I mean, I was shocked to hear such an aggressive voice against America in Europe. And I see that we are not only facing an inflation, we are not facing a risk of a cold winter. Such political and such an economical background is facilitating and giving rise also to radical voices among the political spectrum, from the very right to the very left. Which role might such voices play against the background of these tensions in a cold winter, either South African or European?
Well, again, in times of uncertainty and volatility, economically, geopolitically, and so forth, you will get extremist voices from both sides, from all sides. When people are uncertain, they look for people who, for leaders who have simplistic and populist solutions, which never work in practice. So we can expect a lot of this kind of divisive intervention in the current climate, not only in Europe, but in the United States. In the United States, the debate has become so poisoned that it is almost impossible for Republicans and Democrats to sit down and have a reasonable discussion any longer. The debate has been captured by extremists on both sides, and there's very little room for common ground in the center. And this is the danger, I think, that Europe will face in a period of increasing volatility and uncertainty. People will start looking to populists and those with simplistic solutions to find a way out of their dilemmas.
No, but my question is, a radical voice, for instance, who is instigating to political violence, to mass protests, to stairways or whatever. I mean, he is first of all not producing electricity. Secondly, he is not producing gas. Thirdly, he cannot produce, he cannot generate rising employment. He cannot generate wealth. What can such radical voices do else than dismantling the state, discrediting the rule of law, and actually leading to failed states?
We can always hope that that despite the troubled times, sensible moderates will prevail, both in Europe and also in South Africa. Julius Malema is a threat. He mobilizes on the basis of race. He has followers who wear color-coded uniforms. He likes to be called the Supreme Commander. In other words, if it looks like a fascist, if it talks like a fascist, if it dresses like a fascist, it's a fascist. But the disturbing thing in our case is that Malema's comments have not been repudiated by our own Human Rights Commission. It is very disturbing that our Human Rights Commission more or less whitewashed comments that he made 4 or 5 years ago, to the effect that he was not calling for the slaughtering of all white people, at least not for now. That is disturbing, and it's another sign of polarization, the kind of polarization we're seeing in Europe and the United States, now also in South Africa. Our hope is always that the sensible middle ground will prevail in all of these situations.
I was actually shocked to notice that he was not convicted because of using hate speech and singing a very fascist song and a very radical song kill the Boer, kill the farmers. Now, I'm talking also to the Romanian audience, ladies and gentlemen. That was a former song which some members of the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, and some other radical political movements in South Africa used to sing during apartheid. Now, that song obviously is hate speech. You cannot sing in public that you'd like to kill white people. Now, he's still singing this song, and he was taken to court by the Farmers Association, and the judge found that this was not hate speech. Now, what else is it? If you instigate and sing a song in which you call to kill people of another color, that's obviously hate speech. But it seems that the state of law in South Africa is unable to apply the law and punish him for using such a hate speech.
It's another example of dangerous and increasing racial polarization in our country. And of course, such polarization, if it leads to direct conflict between communities, and not just whites and blacks, we have Indian community, quite a large Indian community, quite a large community of colored people who are descendants of the original Khoi and San people and settlers from all over the place. These, if there is racial conflict in South Africa, it will be disastrous for everyone. There will be no winners from such a process.
I think it's very important also to draw the attention on South Africa here in Europe to show that your country might not always face social tensions, that it may also face racial tensions and extreme xenophobic tensions, and that Europe should be aware of this risk in South Africa. I think this is very important, that Europe is looking carefully how the state of law is preserved in your country, how the constitution is respected. And another aspect which I think worries me about South Africa, but could also be something people will be maybe sooner or later also start talking about in Europe, it's the notion of expropriation without compensation. The World Economic Forum told us that by 2030, you own nothing and you'd be happy. Would you say that Malema or all these politicians who are pioneers of the idea of expropriation without compensation are sort of pioneers in terms of the World Economic Forum, that South Africa is a sort of experiment for such a world without property?
Well, the reality is that the people who call loudest for this kind of dispensation are those who tend to accumulate most property. So Julius Malema himself somehow has managed to accumulate an enormous amount of wealth and belongs to all of the best clubs, drives the fanciest cars. So evidently the people in Davos who are theorizing about such a system don't intend it to apply to themselves. The people who won't have any property are the underlings, not themselves.
Well, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I mean, this is well known. But social tensions and the necessity for political solutions is obvious. And in your country, one of the solutions presented by many politicians and of even former political leaders is the idea of expropriation of farmland. As I said before, the World Economic Forum presented also a scenario that owing nothing. I mean, even in Europe, governments address the issue of a wealth tax. They have not spoken about the idea of expropriation, but I'm pretty sure that very soon in future, in order to prevent people from aggressive protests and from violent protests, will be some sort of radical proposals very close to the idea of expropriation.
Well, such a development would be catastrophic for the kind of society that has developed with a great deal of success in the West and in the East in the last 100 years, or since the Second World War. It's based on the idea that you do not have successful societies without property rights. There is no example of a successful society that does not respect the rights of individuals to own property. It also goes beyond that. You don't have any proper democracies, you can't have any freedom if people are not allowed to accumulate wealth, that is, power as individuals, as groups, as companies. You then have all power consolidated in the hands of the government, the state. And we know where that leads. We've seen state governments operating throughout the world, and they don't succeed. We've seen them in Eastern Europe, and once again, according to the dictum of Talleyrand, governments learn very little. That's what we learn from history.
We addressed the issue of radical political leaders either in South Africa or in Europe or across Europe, and also in America. But what about the smart voices, like voices from the World Economic Forum, who for years have been criticizing and discrediting capitalism? I mean, the one issue is to make sure that the economy performs very well and that there is redistribution by means of taxation within an economy. But a completely different issue is to criticize the fundamental critics of the capitalistic system. I mean, if you start attacking the whole order based on property and based on the free market system, without any attempt to reform it, but just to replace it by something else, what else can we then expect from radical leaders if smart voices, well-educated people, well-dressed people attending conferences in beautiful hotels, in nice Swiss resorts, have such an dystopian or even, well, let's say, extreme destructive opinion about the order? Why do they envisage in sweeping away with this capitalistic system? What they want, what else might be put in place?
Well, I think, again, it's very important to realize that there's a huge difference between intelligence and wisdom. You have many, many intelligent people who are absolutely foolish. And you have many people who are perhaps not geniuses, who have a great deal of wisdom. And wisdom is derived from the accumulated experience of societies and of countries. People who are not inclined to follow the latest fad, much more inclined to look at the world and see, well, what works and what doesn't work. The brilliant guys, the intellectuals, come up with all of these great ideas on how humanity and society can be made more perfect. And they're always the most dangerous people in any phase of history. Nearly all of the abominations in history come from ideologists. And ideologists very often regard themselves as being particularly intelligent and particularly capable of creating better futures. And they always make terrible, terrible mistakes. So I think this is what we have with the World Economic Forum and with these people who now want to tinker with a system that has brought humanity more progress in a shorter time than at any time in history. The fact that we had relatively peaceful times since 1945, the fact that we had World Trade Organization and relatively free trade has meant the greatest advancement of the greatest number of people in human history. And now these brilliant people in Davos want to change all of
Professor Raj Mohan is a very famous columnist at Foreign Policy. He's an Indian. He is also a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute and also a former member of India's National Security Advisory. Let me quote him, he said that the right sees that the World Economic Forum arguments about restructuring the global economy as a dangerous attempt to impose socialism and dismantle traditional society or what remains of it. The left scoffs at Davos man's talk on the crisis of capitalism. It points to the complicity of the Davos Forum in promoting policies that have brought the world to the current impasse and question its capacity to produce solutions. So, I mean, he basically hit the nail on the head. They do not produce solutions, but they discredit an order which made it possible at all for them to have these debates.
Again, foolishness, arrogance, and a degree of contempt for ordinary people, I think, is the hallmark of these new economic czars who want to remodel the world closer to their own desires. But
I'm inclined to say that there might be a connection between creating social unrest and the idea to dismantle a state, to discredit a state, in order to create, also according to the World Economic Forum, new types of social contracts. So to discredit the state in terms of its capacity to find solutions and say, well, no, the state is not good. We must sweep away with the state because we'd like in place a different sort of social order, maybe between corporates and human beings or transhumanist beings. So something which, if you do away with the state, also the civil rights of the citizen disappears. Then we won't have citizens anymore, maybe sort of beings under the custody or tutorship of some other institution. So I might not wonder if dismantling the state by means of unrest, by means of all needs which might come, is aimed at creating a new order where no more state would be necessary. I don't know what utopian minds keep in their brain. I cannot say it precisely, but I'm just under the impression that there is a concept in destroying the classical state as we have seen it till now.
This is not something that is happening only in Europe. If you look at the United States, you see the United States going through a similar process. You have a Democrat government that is, many people on the left wing of the Democrat Party question the very bases on which the United States was established. The idea that the establishment of the United States in 1776 was a good thing. Some people want to redate the founding of America from 1776 to 1619, the date on which the first slave came to New York. So, and there's questioning of the founding fathers, the contents of the Constitution, all of the things that Americans had always regarded as being the core of their national DNA. So there is an enormous intellectual ferment in the United States, as I said, to such a degree that reasonable people on both sides are no longer really prepared to talk to one another. And that is a very serious situation when one considers what we're talking about, the most powerful country in the world, and the hope of Democrats all over the world for their final sustenance and support.
How do you think could this crisis be solved? I personally doubt that having enough gas or electricity might solve the crisis. It might be that this crisis goes much, much deeper than having a problem with gas and electricity. What do you think is the reason for this crisis? How might it be connected to the idea, to this almost obsessive idea to rewrite history and to blame people who are not more among us? How might this crisis be connected to this obsession to rediscover and rebrand history?
I think that's very central to the whole process. It's a kind of a self-revulsion that has come to the fore in a number of European countries. You have ridiculous situations arising where Adam Smith is no longer acceptable. David Hume is no longer acceptable. Some of the great figures in British history are now consigned to dark corners because they lived at a time when there were different values in the world. And the same is happening in the United States. It is, I think, perhaps a symptom of the enormous social and economic changes that are taking place in the world in our superheated, rapidly changing technological society. These are bringing about huge changes, for example, within the United States, where there's a growing cleavage between the top 10% of the population and the rest. The top 10% are earning more and more money, not through any nefarious reason, but because they have a monopoly of the skills that the big tech companies want. They can demand the salaries that they need. And they live a very nice life. They still have families. 80% still get married. They have kids who marry one another. But the bottom 40% of the white American population are falling off the bus. Only 40% of them are now getting married. You have a breakdown in the traditional American family structure, and you have enormous seething discontent, which we see emerging in this bitter debate between the red states and the blue states, between the Trump supporters and those who support Biden and so forth. It's a very disturbing phenomenon. But I think it may be linked somewhere to these enormous changes that are taking place throughout society that are breaking down traditional religion, breaking down values, breaking down the family unit. I think they're all part of the same process.
Well, also experiencing something which actually Romania has in common with South Africa is also a constitutional problem. I mean, if you want the rule of law and there's no more respect towards the constitution, you cannot expect courts and public administration to work well. You cannot expect then, on a later stage, the people to identify with the constitution if you don't preserve it. Our constitution in Romania is in danger. For instance, the current Minister of Justice had advised the judges, for instance, that when applying the law, they should rather apply EU provisions than the provisions of the Romanian constitution and its interpretation by the Constitutional Court. That's a very, very severe breach to any constitutional principles in any democratic country of the world. South Africa has also problems with its constitution that maybe a part of the people in the country do not identify themselves anymore with this constitution. I mean, if the fundamental law of a country is exposed to such a danger, what can be done in order to rebalance such a toxic situation?
Well, in South Africa's case, the constitution still works in most respects. We still have independent courts, and the courts hand down judgments that the government doesn't like. And the government listens to those judgments and obeys them. So those are all positives. But the reality is that a majority of South Africans feel quite rightly that the new constitutional state has actually not improved their real living conditions at all. So there is growing disillusion with the constitution. There is growing failure to vote in elections, even to register for elections. And in a recent poll, 46% of respondents said they would happily give up democracy if they could have an efficient government that provided services, benefits, jobs, and economic growth. So it is a dangerous situation that now confronts our country, and I think that confronts many countries around the world. And it's all part of this, I think, rapidly changing environment, technological, economic, social environment in which all of our countries are involved at the moment.
Now we're approaching the end of this very interesting discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like also to point out on the mission of Dave, you're still engaged in the FW de Klerk Foundation in South Africa, which plays a key role in preserving constitutional rights and the constitution of the Republic in South Africa, particularly in such a hard time when maybe there will be some changes in your country in terms of expropriation without compensation, which will be done by a constitutional amendment. But I think your foundation, the FW, not the foundation you are working for, the FW de Klerk Foundation, is a key player to preserve the heritage of a new democratic South Africa and for the state of law. And I'd like also to wish you from Romania lots of success in continuing this mission, which now almost a year, 3/4 of a year after Mr. de Klerk passed away, may he rest in peace, is still as important as it was before.
Absolutely. That is the simple truth. The future of South Africa will depend directly on our ability, the excellent constitution that we South Africans agreed to 26 years ago. So that's our challenge. But we're now not the only country in the world that has serious challenges. Europe, the whole world, has to now deal with a completely new geostrategic, economic, and social climate.
Dave, thank you very much for joining us here on Monday during lunchtime at DC News in Bucharest in my talk show Outlook. Thanks a lot for having sacrificed an hour from your holiday in Greece. Enjoy your holiday and all the best. And also my best regards to South Africa upon your return to Cape Town.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the best, Dave. Bye.
Bye.